let's take a look at Gearworld: The Borderlands. This is a re-implementation of the old Eon game Borderlands, which I can remember back when I first played, say, Cosmic Encounter, having seen an ad for it and saying, I must have this game. Well, I never saw it. I've never known anyone who's had it. I'm sure I know people online who have it now, but it looked so cool. And from what I can tell, this is a fairly accurate re-implementation, very close to the original, with a change in the, you know how much I hate to say the theme, so with a change in the background story, as it were, and one which maybe makes more sense. We'll take a look at that in a moment. So when I saw a sale on it, essentially, because it has not fared well in terms of either the big name reviewers like, Tom Vassell, who do you expect to like an Eon style game, kind of panned it. I don't know. I don't get the feeling that he played the original Borderlands either, because what little of his review that I skimmed through, I didn't see him saying, oh wow, well this just sucked compared to the original. He seemed just not to like the mechanisms in this game and the way it played out. That's going to depress sales, there's no question. But also, my guess is, even though, Vassell's probably the closest kind of player, the closest of the reviewers to this kind of game and that old Eon lineage and everything. But on the other side of it, and I would think some of his opposition is actually, it's kind of Euro-ish, in some pretty heavy ways, that Eon tended to make some really weird designs way ahead of its time. But on the other hand, for the modern Euro gamer, it's got way too much conflict in it. So I can kind of see where it wouldn't catch on with that either. The one thing that was mentioned in some of the discussions of it that I read was that maybe there's a little more conflict in this version. Anyway, let's take a quick look at what we've got. We have a sort of steampunk type world. It's post-apocalyptic. And you're going to have a combination of mining resources as you would in the regular original game. Things like, I don't know what the actual resources were in the original, but you've got coal, you've got iron, you've got gold. Hey, that all sounds reasonable. You got horses. But you also have scrap metal, cogs, equipment, mechanical stuff. And you can create weaponry, bridges, and two different types of boats, river boats and ocean-going boats. The goal of the game in the original was cities, but here it's these skyworks or skyports or something like that, which your objective is to get 3 of them. Oh, by the way, once I hit the rules, if you want to learn the rules to the game, go watch somebody else's video, because if you're not familiar with me, I'm going to work my way through the rule book. Now, I've read it already. I've played a game of it. But I'm not the best explainer of rules, and there are plenty of other videos out there. You also have these things, which are going to be spread out throughout the board. The players get to control what the layout of the board is in terms of the resources. And these are each going to be things that produce resources. So this is like a gold mine, and initially they'll be placed hidden, but then they get flipped over to see what the resource layout of the map is, and people are going to be placing their control markers. That's all these things are. This would be like a horse mine. Here's another gold mine. Here's a cogs mine. Now, A little bit on what little history I have with this game beyond my, hey, I really wanted to try this and saw it cheap, was that my wife and I played this and as a two-player game. And as a two-player game, I think it's very, very different than it is going to show up playing it as a four-player game. As a two-player game, it became a pure strategy game. I was able to pretty much shut her down and lock her out of the game. Had I been in her position, I would have wanted to continue, but I was convinced she wasn't seeing enough of the game to be able to even make a serious attempt of recovery, even though she understood the rules. We may play it again. It's really not the kind of game that she's going to be good at. The combination of the strategic attacks that you have to make, as well as that it's an entirely luck-free game once you get beyond the initial setup, makes it all very, very difficult. But if you were playing in not two players, there's an opportunity to take down the leading players, which is always dangerous in one of these games. If it was just an area control type game like, Diplomacy is, you feel like, well, geez, it's going to land in some sort of balance of power at the end as the game reaches some sort of stasis point. I don't know that that's going to happen here, because the goal of this game is to get 3 of these suckers, which means that since resources keep being produced, you may have the capability to keep building those even if you're losing territory or something. We'll see how it goes, but I have the feeling that it's going to be very, very difficult to get this game locked into a position where nobody's going to win. It might happen due to interactions of diplomacy, etc., where nobody's actually building any of these because they're too fixated on the combat. We'll see. I could certainly see that happening, though. The rulebook is not very good. It's what, Fantasy Flight, I mean. No, this is the first player marker. Pretty big first player marker. One of the things wrong with the rulebook is, of course, you start off with this, hey, you've got these pictures all over the place and not a lot of words, but the words are actually very repetitive and going over the same concepts again and again. It's very hard to convey the information when you're a little too verbose. And it's not even interesting verbose. It's just repeating things in a lot of places. And it's not always trivial to find things, even though they're in multiple places. All right. So one of the first things that you have to do, though, is you set up the game. And one person is chosen as the first player. I don't remember how that's done. I think it's by random die roll. And that person is going to have the first step in all the setup of the game. And then they move the first player marker to the next player in line, and then that person gets the first turn, gets to be first in the first sequence of actions in a turn. The sequence of play in this game is kind of wanky, and we'll see how that works. But for the setup, what's going to happen is, starting with the first player, you draw one of these, you don't look at it, you place it on a space that you want to be, that doesn't have one that you think would be interesting to put some sort of resource production in. In the two-player game, you're not going to be playing with these islands, but they get added in as there's more players. I don't remember what the exact rules are, but everything's in play with 4 players. The game only holds 4. I didn't look to see, but I think Borderlands with the expansions holds more than 4 players. It would, of course, be hard to put these plastic chips in, but they did add, I think some of the islands came from one of the expansions or something like that. I don't know. Okay, Eon loved to put out expansions, and this was one of their... They didn't make a lot of games. Other than Cosmic Encounter, nothing was terribly popular. And then you just circle around the board with people placing those. Then, the first player, once these are all out, places one of his little tokens to say, I own this space. It's kind of like Risk doing this, right? And then you go around until all the spaces are covered. Unlike Risk, though, these aren't armies or anything like it. These are just control markers that are going to be used throughout the game to indicate that. Your actual military capability is derived from the land itself and from commodity, well, from weaponry and other things that you can build that are present there, and from horses. All right. After you get to the setup, you pass that thing, and I'm starting it over there. I'll be going counterclockwise as usual when I actually play, so that's just how I want to do it. All right, we got some weird stuff with the terrain here. Let me try to discuss it. So, first of all, you've got land areas, which are pretty normal looking. But you've got these rivers running between land areas. Now, the rivers are kind of interesting because they don't prevent two land areas from being adjacent. If two land areas are adjacent to the same little river segment or area, they're considered adjacent to each other, and you can move through them. But boats and such not can move along the river areas as well. You also have a lake, which is over here. The big difference with the lake is it doesn't make land areas adjacent to each other. Now, each land area is adjacent to one lake space. This little central lake space here it's not in play in any sense. This is not a lake. This is a river space here. And that makes sense because this space is adjacent to this one across here anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference that this looks more like a lake. Then there's sea areas, which are off to here. Actually, it's just the sea, I believe. It's just the deep sea. It's divided by blue borders. Yeah, I'm not seeing those. Each land area near the deep sea. Yeah, each land area has got a division here. Okay. Now, what's kind of weird here is the definition of coastal areas. Coastal areas are land areas on the island with red, orange, or yellow highlight. So there's red highlight here, orange here, don't ask why one color over another, and yellow over here. And then the islands are completely surrounded by coastal. What's interesting here is this stuff ain't coastal running along here. All right. Now, I have not played with, in the two-player game, the oceans aren't really in play, and the islands aren't in play, and bridges and steamships are not in play, which changes some of the dynamics a little bit. So that stuff's kind of unfamiliar to me. All right, so in your normal game turn, you're going to follow a certain sequence of play. But in the first turn of the game, the sequence of play is a little different. So I'll step into that as I go through. But first, in a normal play, you would be getting a build phase. In the build phase, if you've got commodities gathered together in an area, you're allowed to turn them into something else. Now, I got to be careful here because I just read the rules to Roads and Boats, which shares some ideas from this game. It's earlier than this version, but later than the old Borderlands game. And I think Borderlands may have been an influence on Roads and Boats. There's no combat in Roads and Boats, though. Well, not of the same sort as there is here. Okay, so if you have certain commodities, you can build things, and this picture shows you what you can build, and it's also reproduced over here in a text form. The picture will show you something like, if I want to build a bridge, I need an iron and a cog. And if I have one of each of those in an area from which I can build a bridge, which wouldn't be across a river. Bridges actually run between these abutments, like so. And they create a sort of semi-area between, an area between the two areas, which is all very interesting. The build phase will not happen on the first turn, which is reasonable because you do not have any commodities in the first turn of the game. All right. Then there's the second phase is going to be production. Now this is something called a dynamic phase. What that means is in your normal turns, and this is where the die is used in the game, you roll a die. On a 1 through 4, you get to play that action, and everybody gets to do it. On a 5, you don't get to play it, and on a 6, whoever's the first player for that sequence of, that round or whatever, gets to decide whether or not everybody gets that action or not. In the first turn, you will be guaranteed a production phase. The production phase works pretty simply. That's where these things come into play. Now, the general rule with these is they will produce what's on them. So, for example, this would produce a gold in the area that they're in. But the exception to that is, if there's already one of that commodity in the area, they don't produce it. That's in general. There's one more exception, which is that the horse mines will produce a horse no matter what. Well, not no matter what. One, you can choose not to. Secondly, they only produce a horse. They don't have to produce a horse in a space well, let me try to explain this, because I'm doing a terrible job of it. Did I mention you should look at somebody else's video? So if you have a horse resource production, or as I call it mine, and it's empty, you put a horse there. If it's not empty, if there is already a horse there, then you can put a horse in an area that's chained to that by other horses and doesn't have a horse in it. And I don't believe you have to put it, I don't believe you can put it into an area if you don't own it, but I'm not positive. Okay. Then we come to another dynamic phase, which is the trade phase. Now, this is not done in the first turn. In the trade phase, right? No, it is done. It may be done. The trade phase is also dynamic, which means you roll a die, as I mentioned. And during this, you can cut deals with other players. And this is probably the weirdest thing that kind of is troubling in the game. And I almost feel like you want to tweak. I want to tweak this, but I'll try playing it as stands. Essentially, what you can do is you can agree to trade goods with someone else, and they disappear from your territory and teleport into the other person's territory. Each player has to, I believe, receive at least one good in any kind of trade. You can make some non-binding deals at the same time, I guess. And let's see. Obviously, in 2 players, we weren't doing much in the trade phase. You can trade resource tokens that were already traded in a previous trade action, and players can trade the same research token type with one another in order to teleport them across. And then they go carefully over the steps of this, and basically you're able to move them wherever you like. And so this gives you, if you can find somebody who will trade with you, a tremendous ability to move your stuff around that you don't normally have in the game. Moving stuff was a big deal in the 2-player game. And I thought it was kind of cool, and I kind of don't really like the idea that you don't have to move your stuff. All right. Next we go to the transport phase, which is again a dynamic phase. You roll the die to see if it happens. And during this, you can do any number of trades. During this, you're allowed to do one transport action. Now, a transport action involves one of a number of things. One option is to move all your goods from one area to an adjacent area that can hold it. That's important because there are some things that can't double up. Resources can double up, but weapons and horses cannot. I think boats can't either, but I'm not sure. Okay. The next type of transport is basically to load your shit onto something that can carry it. And I don't believe, and this is where I'm getting confused with roads and boats, I don't believe there's a limit to how much crap you can put onto something. But maybe I'm mistaken. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any, yeah, there's no limit to the number of things that you can stick inside a boat or a bridge or a horse. Then, boats and horses have the opportunity to move. A horse has 2 movement points. During that movement, it can drop crap off and it can pick up new stuff. Same thing with boats. There is one rule though. When horses end their movement, they have to dump all their goods. And horses are what you start with, which means that you can't like store a weapon on a horse and be in an area with a weapon. You can put horses on boats. I don't think you can put boats on boats. Anyway. There's a third type of movement, which is via supply route, where you can move stuff along a chain of land areas, riverboats, ships, and bridges, as long as they all have horses in them. And again, you're able to kind of loop through it. So if you've got like all your areas have horses in them, you can reshift your resources and weaponry any way that you like. But you're only allowed one of these transport actions. Then we get to a combat phase where each player is generally allowed to make up to 2 successful attack actions. You can make as many unsuccessful attack actions as you like, but you're only allowed to succeed twice. Now, this is not a dynamic game phase, which means it will happen every turn. But on the first turn, you're only allowed to make 1 successful attack action. Now, if you don't want to make 2 successful attack actions, if you only make 1 or none, and you always want to make 1, you're allowed to make an additional transport action. And that applies on the first turn. You're allowed 1 successful attack and 1 transport action. So you might get 2 transport actions for sure on the second turn. Okay. We have not talked about the build phase in detail because we don't do that in the first turn, but let's go back to that in a moment. Like I said, at the end of an entire game round, if you have 3 of these skyworks in territories you control, you win the game. We also haven't talked about battle. We've talked in detail about trade and transport and production for some reason. So build. I did talk a little bit about the build, which is that all your resources have to start in the same area that you're going to use to build a certain thing. You can make as many build actions as you like, and they're done in player order. One person does all his build actions, and then the next player does all his, etc. So you select a land area that you're going to build from. You spend resources from that area equal to the building cost here. So for example, if I wanted to make a weapon, I could spend, and this is clearer on the back of here, 1 iron and 1 coal, or 2 gold. But it's expressed here in a way that the icon makes a lot of sense once you read it once. Some other things, like the riverboat, require just 3 cogs. There's no way around that. Your victory condition requires 1 of each of the resources, iron, coal, cogs, and gold, or you can do it with 4 gold. You can't just substitute gold for something else, but you know, if you have enough gold, you can pay to have something done. Now, there are some advantages that accrue to you if you have one of them skyports. One of the advantages is that you're allowed to build, for each skyport that you have, additional resources above the one that you're normally allowed to stockpile in an area, equal to the number of skyports that you have. So if I have a coal mine and I have one skyport, I'm able to stack 2 coal there. If I have 2 skyports, I'm able to stack 3 coal there. If I have 3 skyports at that stage in the game, I've probably won. The other thing they allow you to do is each skyport gives you a free extra transport during the transport phase. And like I said, in 2 players, transport's really important. That's if I remember these correctly. All right. We have one more thing, which is battle. All right. Battle is complicated. The essential idea of battle is that you pick a space you want to attack. It's got to be adjacent to one of your spaces, one of your things. After you declare what space you're going to attack, and you do that by tipping over the guy's little marker to indicate, hey, we're attacking that space. And it's also being tipped over means you can't attack it again. So if you fail the first time, you can't try to figure out another way to attack it. Then you can call for allies. Hey, sounds like CE here. You can discuss, cut basically non-binding deals until somebody declares an alliance, at which point the alliance part of the deal, the agreement of how many troops people are throwing in or how many strength points people are throwing in, becomes binding. And I'll explain how alliance strength points are handled when at the same time I explain the strength points as a whole. Then you declare what units are going to attack, and the units that are going to be counted in on your attack. The units that are going to be counted in, your force, is going to be from only adjacent areas. You don't have to throw everything in. There's not really much reason not to unless you want to fail on an attack, which you might. At the same time, though, you're allowed to create up to 2 spearheads. Now, spearheads are a kind of neat idea. What they are is something within range of the place you're attacking that you flip over. That's committed to entering the place that you're attacking. It will also throw its strength in. Now, you can spearhead, for example, if I was attacking from here, I could attack from here into here, and we'll explain how the points go, and this horse will count. Or I could spearhead, and the horse will still count. Spearheading allows me to carry goods as well. I'm allowed to bring reinforcements, which are... Okay, so the spearhead is going to be led by horses, weapons, riverboats, or ships. If I'm using a horse, it's allowed to carry up to 1 weapon as a reinforcement in the spearhead. So then I would mark it kind of like that to indicate the horse is carrying the weapon, and then the weapon would be coming in. I don't necessarily have to have the weapon from the same place that I'm attacking from. So this horse could walk through, pick up this weapon, and attack into here. And then if I win, they'd both go in here. I have to essentially prove that the spearheads can pick up all the reinforcements that are going in. Okay. Then the next thing that happens is the defender declares what his defending force is. Now, he doesn't have as much of interest. He has the target and any horse, weapons, or skyworks in the target, and any land areas, riverboats, ships, or bridges that are adjacent to the target, along with anything that contributes to strength, like horses and weapons and such not, that are in those areas. That's usually a number that the outside of alliances, that is a number that the attacker can determine the maximum value of by simply looking on the board and performing some counting. It may get cluttered and complicated. It didn't in the 2-player game. Then you calculate the strength points of both the attacker and the defender. And the way you do that is as follows. Each land area that's being thrown into the attack is worth 1 strength point. Each horse that's involved in the attack is worth 1. Each bridge is worth 2. Each riverboat's worth 3. Each weapon 3. Each skyworks 3. And each ship is worth 5. Now let me check the reinforcements again. The attacking player declares up to 1 horse and up to 1 weapon as the spearhead reinforcement. Okay. You can't declare a horse as the reinforcement if the lead is a horse, nor can you declare any reinforcements if your lead is a weapon for that particular spearhead. And whatever is that spearhead has to be able to pick up and carry the reinforcements. So a boat could pick up a horse and bring it into the attack. If the attacker manages to get at least as many strength points as the defender, and allies who were adjacent could have thrown their strength in during the alliance phase, then the attack is successful. If the attack is successful, a couple of things happen. 1, color of the player, the color of the space changes. And 2, any spearhead stuff goes into that space and flips over. And now you're set up, you could make another attack from that new area, right? Now, let me see what happens from alliances. Okay. You don't need the approval of the person you're allying with. Jeez, it sounds like CE there. But do you get anything for an alliance? And the answer seems to be no. The answer seems to be no. So if you have a success, you take the territory, and if it was your first successful attack, normally you would have the option to keep making attacks until you get a second one. On the first turn, you don't have that option. At that point, you'd have to take a transport action. If you fail, all your tokens flip back up to their normal size, and you can try to keep making attacks on different targets. You just can't attack the same target twice. And you can do that for, until you've attacked all the areas you don't own that are adjacent to you. The reason behind that is that, I don't know about the reason behind that. I don't know what I'm saying. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about these riverboats, because can I attack? Okay. I don't believe that I have to be adjacent to launch an attack. For example, if I want to attack an island, I could sail there with one of my ships. Now, I don't know how ships are positioned. And I remember that's an issue of this game. The riverboat endpoints must overlap the origin area and into another land area adjacent to the river area. So the riverboats end up doing something like this. And they are now adjacent to both of these areas and are a way of transporting through them. Now, the riverboat also has its own movement, so if I load it up from one of these areas, I can set sail. The steamship is going to be in a sea area adjacent to the origin area. Now, when I place a boat I put my little marker on it to indicate that I have it. With the bridges, same thing. If I put a bridge, I get a little marker to indicate I own it. And that bridge can be attacked. It has a strength of 2 instead of the 1 of an area. But I'm trying to see the movement of boats. Ships have 10 movement points. To spend a movement point, the active player moves a ship into an adjacent sea area. Okay, so let's start with the riverboat, because we haven't talked about that. I haven't played with them either. A riverboat has 8 movement points. To spend a movement point, the active player moves a riverboat to any adjacent river or lake area. It can't end its movement in the same river or lake as another riverboat. So if I owned this riverboat and loaded some crap up on it, I could move up to 8. So I could go 1, 2, 3, and I can set these up for, I don't know if there are ones that cross a boundary. It looks like the boundaries match the land boundaries pretty well. So I'd be, I'd move my bridge that the boat provides somewhere else. And now I can launch attacks into different sorts of areas. And I can do that by spearheading with the boat as well, because boats are able to spearhead just as much as regular units. The boat wouldn't actually move though. So if I wanted to attack this area from down here, I could set it up with a spearhead like that. Remember, I'm only allowed to add 2 reinforcements to it, and no more than 1 horse and 1 weapon on each spearhead. The ship has 10 movement points. See deep sea movement. Okay, so moving from a sea area to an adjacent, from a sea area adjacent to a land area, to any sea area adjacent to a land area on an island, if the colors match, costs me 4 movement points. Likewise, going from the island to Hastis. But what about moving along the coast? That is going to be adjacent sea areas, which are these coastal regions. So, actually, I'm not sure that they're coastal regions. Coastal regions are adjacent to the sea areas. I'm really confused by this whole sea area thing, and I'm kind of glad I didn't have to play with it before. See, this says to where and from where ships can travel when moving. I have the feeling that these are coastal regions that just don't match the island. So you can't make that 4-point shift from, the same color to the island. And it looks to me like you sail along the coast at 1 movement point per. And it's just 4 movement points to sail back and forth from forth from an island, and that these are supposed to be coastal areas. Again, that's my guess as to what the rules have. Stacking limits. So, rivers and lakes can only have 1 riverboat per area. Each sea area can only have 2 ships in an area. A player cannot place one or end the movement of a riverboat or ship if they exceed the stacking limit, whether it's theirs or otherwise. However, you can sail through an area that's already at stacking limit, picking stuff up and moving along. Skyworks. I've already given the advantages to Skyworks. Supply routes. I think we've talked about these. Okay, restricted tokens. This is what I was looking for. So weapons and horses are restricted. You're only allowed to have one in any place, a land area, riverboat, ship, or bridge, at the end of any action. If you end up with more in the same place, they eat one another. You end up with just one there anyway. Your plastic figures, you can use something else, or if a player's not in the game. It is possible to get knocked out of the game. If you lose your last area, you're knocked out of the game. One thing to realize about the conquest is you get whatever's in the territory you just took. Now, that may mean that you're sending horses and weapons into an area with horses or weapons, and they end up neutralizing each other. But that's okay. There's options. The option that you can't share a victory, that the game has to keep going until somebody has more skyworks than any other player. Which seems like a good option, but we're not going to play with that because there's a diplomatic advantage. There's a possible diplomatic end to the game where two people could say, look, we can both win if we work together on this. There's the option to leave all the islands out, and you use less tokens. In less players, you use less tokens, less of these production tokens. Okay. And then there's the option, when you roll a 6 on the dynamic phase, instead of letting the first player just choose, that the players can vote on whether or not there's going to be that action. That seems like a pretty minor little addition to me, but it does take away some of the power from the first player, who already has some interesting advantages, I think. I think the advantage accrues to whoever's the first player at any given time. That's all I've got here. There's some story about it and everything, but it's more like, just one individual character here talking about somebody's experience in the world. There's more about the world elsewhere, telling you in the introduction about why you're busy building these skyports, which is that there's people up in cloud cities and they need more resources, yet they have lots of advantages which they can provide to the people who are on the ground. Anyway, we're going to give this a shot and start setting it up. As you can tell, the things that I haven't played with, like the boats, or where I have kind of the sketchiest conception of the roles. In particular, the coastal areas, the way they're defined seems really strange to me. I think these are sea areas, coastal areas. You can dock boats there. The only thing that they don't affect is crossing over here, which is it's poorly expressed in the rules if that's what it means. If it's not, the way the rules are written seems to indicate from here to here there is no coastline. The boats just can't dock there, which seems kind of bogus to me. All right, let's send it up.